Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7, or Scotland a little after 7. We apologise for the delay tonight on this Thursday, the 15th of August. I'm Douglas MacKenzie with stories from Scotland and around the world, and to discuss what's behind those stories, I'm happy to be joined once again by Maureen Watt. Maureen, as you I'm sure know, was a minister in the Scottish Government with responsibilities in education, training and health. She was the SNP MSP for Aberdeen South and Kincardine North. North Kincardine. Welcome again, Maureen.
Hi, Douglas. How are you this evening?
I'm very well. Nice to see you again, though it wasn't that long since we were talking on this programme before.
No, it's holidays. I think a lot of folk are away on
Yes,
holidays, presenters and guests.
that's right. Yes, even politicians, and especially retired politicians, deserve a holiday. So we start tonight, as we always do, with an update from Ukraine on this day 904 since the full-scale Russian invasion of the country. A wave of Ukrainian drone strikes targeted Russia's Voronezh, Kursk, Savizleka and Borysoglebsk air bases, where warplanes take off to drop glide bombs on Ukraine. Ukraine also claimed on Wednesday to have shot down a Russian Su-34 jet in the Kursk region, where it said it had also captured 100 prisoners. Ukraine's Interior Minister Igor Klimenko said the Kursk operation was creating a buffer zone to protect our border communities from daily enemy attacks. Apart from Kursk being invaded, Russia's Belgorod region has also declared a state of emergency because of Ukrainian attacks. The Ukrainian leadership's long-term plans for the Kursk incursion are unclear, but the longer it lasts, the harder it is for the Russian President Vladimir Putin to brush it off, while the Russian elite will be watching to see if he can come out on top. Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk said Ukraine would open humanitarian corridors for evacuating civilians towards both Russia and Ukraine. Ukrainian officials also promised access for international humanitarian organizations, likely to include the International Committee of the Red Cross and the UN. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said he met top officials to discuss the humanitarian situation and establishing a military commandant office, if needed, in an occupied area that Kyiv says exceeds 1,000 square kilometers. Ukraine's top commander, Alexander Syrskyi, said that Russian town of Sucha, a transshipment hub for Russian natural gas flowing to Europe via Ukraine, was fully under Ukrainian control, with gas still flowing. However, Ukraine has no intention of claiming someone else's land, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry said. The Russian ruble fell further against the dollar on Wednesday, for a loss of over 8% since the incursion began. Ukraine's ombudsman Dmitry Lubinets said he had discussed the Russian prisoners taken in the Kursk region with his Russian counterpart. I see that this situation at least forced the initiative from the Russian side, he told national TV. The heaviest fighting of the war remains in Ukraine's Donetsk region, and Zelensky said his forces there would receive more weapons than originally planned from the next Western support package. Russian drones attacked a medical battalion vehicle in Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv region, killing a medic and wounding other people, regional authorities said. The attack reportedly took place in the settlement of Velykolodazh. A Russian ballistic missile hit port infrastructure in Ukraine's southern city of Odessa on Wednesday evening, injuring a port employee and a grain carrier driver, Ukrainian officials said. Russia pulled out of a UN-brokered deal that guaranteed safe export of Ukrainian grain to guard against world hunger. Ukraine has since established its own maritime corridor for shipments. Maureen, we spoke about the invasion, Ukraine move into Russia on Sunday. It's gone further, but one thing is striking is the different way in which Ukraine has taken land and dealt with prisoners and dealt with the civilian population when compared to the Russians moving into Ukraine.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there from the pictures that you can see on television, there seems very little destruction of buildings. You see soldiers handing out water to Russian civilians who've been hiding in underground shelters. You see humanitarian being set up for people who want to evacuate. And altogether a different invasion, if you like. Oh, okay, taking down Russian flags and putting up Ukrainian ones, to make no mistake, that Ukraine is now in control of those parts of Russia. And I think I'm also struck by how little Vladimir Putin has had to say on the issue. Clearly, he is a man and a leader and despot who, up till now, has kind of been the guarantor of security for the Russian people. And now that's been violated in quite a big way, insofar as, people are evacuating from the region. So it'll be interesting to see how this pans out in the next few days and weeks, because will Ukraine continue to go further into the Kursk region? Will they take over more key installations? Will they just hold on to what they've got? I mean, even the expert Michael Clark didn't seem to know exactly what the Ukraine's plans are, and I think this time they've been keeping them pretty close to their chest. I suppose also it depends what happens in the occupied territories, the Russian occupied parts of Ukraine. I mean, if fighting escalates in the Donetsk region, as you mentioned in your report, will that hinder Ukraine's incursion into Kursk? So it certainly has opened a new front, if you like, in the war. And it's really very interesting to see what the outcome will be. Will it force Putin to the negotiating table? Will he just be prepared to let those parts of Russia go? It'll be really interesting to see what Putin's next move is, although he has said that a red line has been crossed. So clearly he won't let it lie.
Thank you, Maureen. And very strikingly, you say there that all the experts have been guessing as to what is happening. Ukraine has managed to keep this very secret and very close to its chest, which is a real rarity, it seems, for governments these days. Moving on to Gaza now, and the UN's human rights chief Volker Turk has said that today marks a grim milestone with the news that the death toll from Gaza has surpassed 40,000. His statement said, "This unimaginable situation is overwhelmingly due to recurring failures by the Israeli Defense Forces to comply with the rules of war." He said, on average, about 130 people have been killed every day in Gaza over the past 10 months. The scale of the Israeli military's destruction of homes, hospitals, schools, and places of worship is deeply shocking. Earlier today, 40 far-right Israeli activists tried to break into the Gaza Strip to conduct a Jewish prayer service, but were stopped by security services. UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy will travel to Israel in the coming hours to hold talks with the country's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, according to reports on Sky News. The Scottish Greens have accused the SNP of hypocrisy on Palestine following reports of a controversial meeting between Israel's Deputy Ambassador to the UK and SNP Minister Angus Robertson. We'll turn to the Scottish perspective on this in a moment, but first of all, that figure of more than 40,000 dead in Gaza. I also read a piece in the Lancet which said that the death toll in Gaza could reach 186,000, or 8% of the population. It does seem more than terrible that at this stage in the conflict, all we can really do is argue about the number of people who've been killed.
Yeah, it's horrific. I mean, 8% of your population, that is, and we're talking about, what, 2 million people of a population on a size of Arran. It must be absolutely awful. And just practical things like burying your dead. I mean, it's just horrific. And, clearly, I think internationally there has been a ramp up in the last few days about trying to get the parties round the table to talk about peace. But Netanyahu seems completely what's the word? Completely against, getting involved. He just wants to finish his operation and that's it. But however, I think, cooling of relations with the US, Biden telling him that, he is totally against what he's doing in terms of continuing the war against ordinary people, Palestine, Gaza. There doesn't seem to be any movement in hostage release. And surely, you would have thought that that was one of the things that Netanyahu should be pressing on, and indeed much of his own population want him to do. But we haven't heard of any releases, unless I've missed it, for a number of weeks now. So obliteration of Gaza is not of itself going to bring the hostages back. So I think it's absolutely imperative that all the players get Netanyahu round the table. And maybe David Lammy will have some influence on that if he's flying to Israel in the hope of meeting the Israeli Prime Minister. So we will see what happens in the coming days. But I think, Antony Blinken has got more influence than David Lammy, but if there's a pile-on of international influence on Netanyahu, maybe, just maybe, he might relent a bit and at least start discussions on peace, because, peace is the only way forward.
Indeed, thank you. And in terms of influence on Israel, you mentioned David Lammy. There's been a huge outcry on social media about Angus Robertson's meeting with the Israeli ambassador. Now, of course, what's on social media doesn't always reflect what people are thinking or what people are saying at home and in the street. But what is your view on it? Is it so much sound and fury signifying nothing, or is this something which will come back to haunt the Scottish government, who up until this point have been very fair in their demands for a ceasefire and for a two-state solution? Is this going to blemish that record?
Well, I'm glad that you kind of separated out what social media says compared to what's happening elsewhere. I'd point out that the Israeli state have always been very forward at meeting politicians. I mean, I remember meeting them on a number of occasions in the Scottish Parliament. So they're very proactive in engaging and trying to engage with politicians. Angus Robertson is the Minister, Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs. So it would be normal for new ambassadors and consuls to request a meeting with him. Whether it was properly held is another question. And I think, there is a question over timing of the release of when it happened and things like that. So maybe there was some sort of caution about the meeting. But it was made clear that, the invasion of Gaza and the future of Gaza was very much on the agenda. And I will have that Angus Robertson would have made the Scottish Government's position very clear. Whether it's mischief making on social media, I think we have to wait and see. But I'm sure that Angus Robertson will have used the opportunity in no uncertain terms to tell the new ambassador what the public opinion in Scotland is about the war.
Yeah, in terms of the way it was handled, do you think? I mean, you spoke about the power and the effectiveness of the Israeli government, which we've known about for years. Was it a little bit of naivety, or down to the summer holidays of the Scottish government, that they didn't get their statement out first?
Well, I mean, there could be, loads of spads on holiday, but still there's somebody there, or comms person there to handle that. So I honestly don't know the ins and outs. I just know as much as anybody else. But clearly, opposition and mainstream media and mischief makers on social media are trying to make the maximum out of it. But we're talking about David Lammy flying out to meet Netanyahu. Surely dialogue at all levels is better than none. And if the Israeli ambassador went away with a flea in her ear, then that's surely to the good. So, and she's duty bound to report back to her government as an ambassador. So, yeah, whether it's ignored or not, we don't know. But she certainly will have heard what the Scottish people think of it. And I'm sure that Angus will have told her all about if she didn't know already, about the many pro-Palestine demonstrations there have been throughout Scotland, and how a ceasefire is what the Scottish people want. And I've no doubt that Angus will have conveyed that to her.
Indeed, thank you. Yeah, jaw is always better than war, as Churchill said. So we'll see if the story runs and runs, or if it's something which fizzles out after the initial mischief making, as you called it. Staying in the UK and the UK economy has extended its recovery from recession after recording growth of 0.6% in the 3 months to now, handing a boost to the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, in the run-up to the autumn budget. Figures from the Office for National Statistics, ONS, show gross domestic product continued to grow in the second quarter after a rise of 0.7% in the first 3 months of 2024. This reading matched the forecasts of city economists. Despite this, monthly GDP growth was flat in June as wet weather deterred shoppers from spending in what has been a washout summer for retailers. According to the latest snapshot, service sector output increased by 0.8% in the second quarter, powered by scientific research and development. There was also strength in the IT, transport, law, architecture, and engineering sectors. Consumer-facing service output fell by 0.1%, reflecting a weaker period for purchases of physical goods, reflecting the ongoing cost of living crisis. Manufacturing and construction output also fell. The figure comes after a lackluster performance over the past decade, and high living costs, elevated interest rates, and faltering productivity gains are acting as a brake on momentum. The UK economy entered recession, defined as 2 consecutive quarters of falling GDP, in the second half of last year, as households cut back on spending and is only now starting to grow. It's not a huge growth, 0.6% GDP, but still good news. One thing which surprises me, you might have a view on, Maureen, is that this is the second quarter now where it's grown, and it was as predicted by city economists. Why did Rishi Sunak decide to have his election, when it looked like the economic figures were going to get better?
Well, personally, I think that he just thought, to heck with this game of soldiers, I'm out, sort of thing. Although he's still there until they find a successor. And he has said in the country. We haven't heard whether he's staying on as an MP, though. But yeah, I mean, he was getting it from all sides. Not less from Labour, I would say, than from Reform and people within his own party. They do say that governments lose elections; it's not the opposition wins them, and I think that was clearly the case here. I honestly just think he'd, but maybe it'll come out in his memoirs or whatever. But on the wider issue of the growth, I hope we get it in the budget, but I would like to know what sort of percentage of growth Rachel Reeves thinks the UK economy needs so that we can get rid of austerity. Remember, Anas Sarwar has really got himself in a hole when he said, "Watch my lips," or "Read my lips." Can't remember exactly. There'll be no more austerity under Labour, and it's precisely what we've got. So it's going to be very interesting to see what level of growth Rachel Reeves thinks we need in order to start pulling out of austerity, if that is their aim, although I hate my doots. But 0.6 growth is okay. At least it's in the black or a positive, if you like. But as I say, it'd be really interesting to find out what level the goal is for the new Labour government, because it's very difficult, I think, to balance, whether too much growth causes more inflation and the whole thing spirals again, or what. So whether the growth will influence the interest rates of the Bank of England, that's always important too. We'll have to wait and see till their next pronouncement on that.
Yes, thank you.
I would add that it certainly doesn't feel any better for the ordinary person in the street.
No, indeed. And you mentioned austerity, and that's our next story. The Scottish media has been wall to wall with news of the Scottish Government cutting winter fuel payments to pensioners, and that all unnecessary spending has been blocked by Finance Minister Shona Robertson. But what are the facts behind these announcements, and are these decisions the result of Scottish Government or Westminster policies? The pensioners' full payments is in the process of being devolved to Social Security Scotland, and had been planned to be distributed to all Scottish pensioners by the Scottish Government for the first time this winter. When the new Labour government came into power in July, Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced that there was a £22 billion in-year deficit, and she would have to make immediate spending cuts, including announcing that the winter fuel payments in England would now be means tested, and had a stroke, cutting the Barnett consequentials, which would have been due to come to Scotland, forcing the Scottish Government to reconsider how the benefit in Scotland would be funded. Uncertainty remains of the full extent of UK government cuts, and how it leaves the Scottish Government in the position of being unable to predict how much money it will receive from the UK Treasury, as the Scottish Government must balance its budget and is unable to borrow to make up for any unforeseen overspend. The only legal path open to Scotland is not to spend money it does not know for certain it has. Well, Maureen, you must have been involved in many spending discussions in government, and it's all very well for the press to say, "Oh well, the Scottish Government has control. It can make up the loss. It can mitigate this," but it can't really, can it? There are no levers to do so.
No, and and even in the early days, I used to wonder how John Swinney, as finance secretary, could sleep at night wondering about balancing the books, because, as you say, there is no room. There is very little room for the Scottish Government to borrow, and we're almost wholly dependent on the block grant from Westminster, which you would expect when the Westminster Tory government kept making announcements that we would get the Barnett formula consequentials. But Rachel seems to not only have stopped that completely, insofar as any pay deals, for example, have got to be found out of existing resources, but she's actually cutting back on what the Scottish Government gets. So, for the mainstream media to say that the Scottish Government hasn't fully funded its commitments, that is just nonsense. What the Scotland has to do now is react to what the new Westminster government is doing in slashing the Scottish government's budget. And yes, tough decisions are going to have to be made. I mean, I'm beginning to wonder if the Labour government wants to completely ignore the devolution settlement. I mean, you know, even new into government, that the Scottish Government has a contract with the people of Scotland through the social contract, in that they're taxed a bit more but get very much more in terms of prescriptions, school, university fees, and the like, and the baby box. And they're clearly trying to, they're not interested in universality in Whitehall. That's clear. Forgetting, of course, that it costs more in civil servants' time to have people work out who's entitled to benefits like the fuel payment than not. But yet they're talking about, not increasing staff. So I think they're getting them in a real fankle. And I think the principle of universality, where everybody gets the same benefits, but some pay a bit more in tax, is a much better way of doing it, a much fairer and a more inclusive way of doing things than expecting people, pensioners in particular, who are probably not au fait with claiming stuff online, about the only way you can do it these days. So I think it's grossly unfair, and I think that's something, when parliaments come back, that the SNP should make a big thing of in both parliaments.
Yeah, I mean, you made the point there about the media being particularly unfair in saying that these were Scottish Government cuts. I think all the newspapers in Scotland today had that line, except the National, which covered Kate Forbes' comments. So the Scottish Government has a pretty tough task on its hands to get its message out of why things are as they are.
Yeah, it was the same over prisoner releases. I think Scotland were behind England and Wales on doing that. England and Wales had announced that they were doing it before Scotland did, although certainly Angela Constance had been thinking about the need for it for a long time. So yeah, it's always SNP, Scottish Government under the SNP bad, forgetting, of course, to say that the same is and worse is happening in England and Wales. And if you speak to people from England, they that the people in Scotland get a better deal from their government, and in lots of things that you wouldn't think of. I mean, if you look at things like screening for prostate problems and prostate cancer, that was introduced in Scotland long before it was in England. Now, these things cost money. We've, and of course, introduced in England since then. But I think what we never have in this country, and I mean the UK wide, is the conversation about, do you want public services, but do you also want to pay for them like they do in the Scandinavian countries with higher tax? Or are you still expecting good public services, but US levels, low levels of tax? And we've never really had any from the SNP probably, that are prepared to be honest with the public on that. And clearly, the UK Labour government is not being honest with people. And, some parties, including the SNP and Stephen Flynn, tried to point out that there would be a black hole. They've since been proved right. But Labour just hoodwinked the public.
Yeah, thank you. Staying with Scottish economics, and perhaps an even more mystifying topic, the Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland 2023 to 2024, or GERS, Annual Statistics Spinfest, was published yesterday. But what do these figures represent, and what do they tell us about the Scottish economy? And do they tell us about the management or mismanagement of the economy by the Scottish Government, or about the mismanagement of the economy by the UK Government in Westminster? And what do they tell us about the economy of an independent Scotland? Now, every year, economists tell us how useless these figures are, yet they continue to be published. But it does seem a bit strange that on Tuesday we were a energy-rich country or region in the UK press, able to send £3 trillion worth of electricity to England with nothing coming back. Yet on Wednesday, we were this poor huddle of folk who only survive by the grace of the United Kingdom subsidising us by £2,340 each year. It's not. It's not really believable in any sense, but yet the papers have tried to push that line.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know the reason why we still continue to publish these figures when they're really quite meaningless. I mean, in short, I suppose it says that the spending of councils, Scottish Government and UK Government in Scotland outstrips what taxation is brought in. But the taxation that's brought in is wildly inaccurate. So with the introduction of Scottish income tax, it's got a bit better, but in terms of VAT, corporation tax, national insurance, and some and excise duties, for example, we're really kind of boring about in the dark for figures. And it also, the big thing is that it expects in an independent Scotland expenditure at a UK level in Scotland to continue. Now that clearly is not the case. For example, we wouldn't want expenditure on nuclear weapons. So, I'm grateful to Richard Murphy for his explanation in the National Day. But you do wonder, I suppose, there would be such an outcry if the Scottish SNP government stopped the GERS thing. But maybe there's an argument for taking a hit on it and just saying it's so ridiculously rubbish that we're not going to do it anymore. And maybe come up with something different. I don't know.
Yes, indeed. But paraphrasing what you're saying, the argument which was put out in the press release by, I think, 5 Conservatives that this proves that the independence will never work. I mean, obviously not the first time they put that, is nonsense, because the figures really have nothing to do with how an independent Scotland would operate.
Yeah, and that's why, the Scottish National Party needs to remind people why we believe that independence is the best way forward. And I'm always in favour of comparisons with other countries. If places like Denmark had the same resources as Scotland, they'd be very, very wealthy indeed. We see how much more wealthy Norway has been, and Norway used to be really poor when I was little, very poor indeed. Look, the GDP per head in Ireland is much better than in Scotland and the rest of the UK. And Ireland experienced huge levels of poverty, when I was younger. So the opportunities that independence brings are huge, and we just need to grab it. And even the Tories have to admit, if you ask them the question, could survive on its own, they have to say yes. So I just wish more people would see that we do not have to live with austerity. There are other countries doing very well, that are not, where their populations aren't facing the austerity and the kind of economic choices that the UK government makes, which, by the way, still means that the wealthy get more and wealthier, and the poor and the rest of us, feel poorer and poorer and miserable with it.
Indeed. Moving to a country with a different set of problems. 3 years on since the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan, the 300 plus reported cases of Afghan women being killed by men since then are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the true scale of gender-based violence in Afghanistan, according to new data analysis. Open source investigators at the Center of Information Resilience's Afghan Witness Project combed through social media and news sites to record 332 reported cases of femicide since the Taliban took Kabul on 15th of August 2021. The analysis, which is one of the first attempts to try to collect data on the levels of sexual and physical violence against women in Afghanistan, also found 840 women and girls had been subject to gender-based violence from 1st of January 2022, when Afghan Witness began collecting data, to 30th of June this year, almost one a day. More than half of the reported cases said that Taliban officials were responsible. Analysis of crimes allegedly perpetrated by the Taliban revealed 115 incidents of sexual violence, including forced marriage, sexual slavery, assault, and rape. Another 73 incidents concerned non-sexual violence and torture, while 113 involved the reported arrests of women, many for flouting the regime's repressive policies on women and girls, which include forbidding them to travel significant distances without a male guardian. The Taliban's shutdown of most independent media outlets and the widespread restriction and persecution of journalists, as well as continuing political repression and online intimidation, means that the number of cases reported is likely to be a vast underestimation of the true scale of death and violence inflicted on Afghan women, according to David Osborne, the project director of Afghan Witness. So not only the shutdown of journalism in Afghanistan, but interest, concern in the Western world seems to have disappeared. We hear very little about Afghanistan these days, Maureen, but when we do, it's truly dreadful.
Yes, it's good that Broadcasting Scotland here we're talking about it 3 years after the Taliban took over. It seems much longer than that, actually, because, as you say, we don't hear much about it unless you get a special reporter coming back from Afghanistan. But clearly, the oppression of women and girls is huge in Afghanistan, and it would be good to know the extent with the internet and things now, how much they are managing to continue with education underground, because the will and the drive of women and girls to do that in Afghanistan is absolutely huge. But what drives the Taliban to treat women and girls so badly, when it's their mothers, their wives, their own children, seems to me absolutely horrific. Is it presumably it's lack of education, but yet they need so many people to be educated if they're going to be able to look after their population and the economic plight of people in Afghanistan has clearly got worse since the Taliban took over. But any uprising against the Taliban doesn't seem to be emerging yet, but we shall see. But in the meantime, one has to feel for the women and girls in Afghanistan at this time.
Yeah, back to Scotland again. Today, Cabinet Secretary for Transport Fiona Hislop announced a short list of contractors to be invited to the next stage of the procurement process for the fourth section of the A9 dualling programme, the Tay Crossing to Ballinluig project. The shortlisted contractors who will be invited to bid for the contract to upgrade approximately 5 miles, 8.2 kilometres of the A9 to dual carriageway between the Tay Crossing and Ballinluig are Balfour Beatty Civil Engineering, Wills Brothers Civil Engineering and John Graham Construction Limited. The announcement comes just weeks after the contract for the A9 dualling Tomatin to Moy project was awarded to Balfour Beatty. Speaking on the announcement today at a site, Ms Hislop said, "Today's announcement demonstrates this government's unwavering commitment to progressing our A9 dualling delivery plan to complete dualling of the A9 between Perth and Inverness by the end of 2035. Shortlisting contractors for the Day Crossing to Ballinluig project is the next step in the procurement process, and we expect to award this contract in summer 2025. Today I met with Balfour Beatty, the contractor responsible for construction of the Moy project. I've seen at first hand the complex nature of the work required to deliver this construction contract. When construction gets underway in earnest in this section, it will roll continually until the A9 between Perth and Inverness is fully dualled. The Tay Crossing to Ballinluig project will be the next section to reach construction." Very much hot potato, the political hot potato, the dualling of the A9. So interesting to see what the reaction is going to be to this next phase, Maureen.
Yes, I mean, the commitment of the Scottish National Party and government to join all our cities with dual carriageways was made right at the beginning in 2007 or in the manifesto for that, and it remains because it's vitally important that happens in a modern, democratic, inclusive society. But what I fear is that many people who are not familiar with the A9 and the A96 don't, especially on the A9, don't understand the topography and the difficulty it is in dualling the A9. I mean, it's a huge, huge project which has been derailed by COVID, cost of living crisis, and the crashing of the economy by Liz Truss. And we shouldn't underestimate how much that has contributed to the increase in costs in these projects. It'll be interesting to see, be a fly in the wall and see what kind of costs these contractors have put in, because for many things that you need, steel and everything that you need, the costs so volatile that in some cases, in some projects, and I'm not necessarily talking about the A9, companies just haven't bid because they aren't able to give prices that would stick during the duration of the contract. So it's really difficult, and I think the Transport Secretary has a huge job in front of her to try and get value for money for this project. And I just that those detractors, I suppose that's an empty wish really, but they would recognise the huge difficulties that are involved in these major construction projects. I mean, we did such a super job on the Queensferry crossing, which came in on time and under budget, that's expected for everything else now. But the landscape has changed so much since that project that it really is not something that we can compare things with anymore. And as I say, it's very difficult for the contractors to give um, a an estimate that they can stick to, and it'll be interesting to see what's built in the way of costs, because everything is, as I say, so volatile at the moment.
Yeah, I suspect it'll be one of those projects where people who are complaining now about cost overruns and delays and then the roadworks will then think how wonderful it is once it's finally built. We've seen that on many similar projects. Staying with the government has published new guidance to empower schools to take action on mobile phone use as part of the next steps in ongoing work to improve relationships and behaviour in schools. The Behaviour and Relationships in Schools Action Plan and Targeted Guidance for Teachers to Manage Mobile Phone Use in Schools sets out steps to be deployed at the national, local and school level over the next 3 years in response to concerns about relationships and behaviour in schools, including supporting the effective recording and monitoring of inappropriate behaviour, encouraging schools to reinforce a positive ethos and culture, providing guidance and support to ensure schools can embed relationships and behaviour policies which set clear expectations of relationships and behaviour. The new guidance on mobile phone use makes clear that while it is for individual schools to determine what action to take, head teachers are empowered to take the steps they see fit, including a full ban on mobile phone use in school if that is their judgment. Aside from impacting behaviour, a growing body of evidence shows mobile phone use also impacts on learning. The Programme of International Student Assessment, PISA, 2022 data showed that almost a third of 15-year-olds in Scotland and across all OECD countries reported being distracted using digital devices in most or every maths class, and around a quarter reported being distracted by others using digital services. During a visit to Stonelaw High School in Rutherglen, Education Secretary Jenny Gilruth said, "Since the last action plan on relationships and behaviour in Scotland schools was published in 2017, our children and young people have experienced periods of significant challenge, including a global pandemic and a cost of living crisis, which is causing real difficulty for families across the country. There is no doubt this has had a major impact on their schooling and how they learn." Well, Maureen, you had responsibility for education during your time in government. Is this a good step forward, or is this trying to build a dike against the incoming sea in mobile phone use in
Well,
schools?
fortunately, I didn't have this problem to deal with in my time as Minister for Schools and Skills. But I welcome the announcement from Jenny Gilruth today. I think it's great that it reinforced the for schools and local authorities, and particularly schools and head teachers, to decide themselves how they deal with this problem, because each school is different. The ethos in schools can be very different, and the head teachers are best placed to know how to tackle this problem in their schools. There will be some where it's a really big problem. There's be some where the head teacher has already taken steps on this. It has been linked with discipline in schools, and in some schools we've seen that actually pupils themselves have realised that discourse with their fellow pupils at break time is infinitely more preferable to texting them when they're sitting next to you. So I think it can make really can make a real difference if pupils know the role of their mobile phones and when they are to be used and when not. And it was good that you mentioned the OECD report, which highlights that this is a problem in many countries, and it's not just a Scottish problem, which is the idea that you would get from the mainstream media. It does, in terms of the discipline in schools, include the fact that the head teachers can exclude pupils. And there's been a commitment, or a presumption is the word I'm looking for, presumption against exclusion up till now. And I do worry about that, because it is obviously the conduct of last resort, the measurement of last resort. But excluded pupils end up roaming the streets or hiding in their bedrooms, and these pupils really do need intensive help rather than just being excluded and left to their own devices. So I hope that it isn't seen as something that can be used more than it perhaps has been up to now. That would be a concern of mine.
Yeah, the Heidi always has a tough job, and this is another responsibility. I can imagine there will be cases of outraged parents complaining about the restriction on their children, but we'll see how it develops. Finally, in Scotland, a University of Strathclyde researcher specialising in minority languages has been appointed to lead a group established by UNESCO to support the protection of Indigenous tongues. Dr. Ingeborg Burney, a senior lecturer in Strathclyde's Institute of Education, has been named as rapporteur for the ad hoc group Provision of Education, and is one of only 20 experts worldwide to have been selected for the group. Over the next 3 years, Dr. Burney and her colleagues will conduct an audit of current provision for Indigenous languages. The group will also create a framework for communities, organisations and governments to carry out their own evaluation of provision. The outcomes of the audit will be used to create a policy recommendation which considers knowledge of a language and culture, as well as the linguistic competencies in the language, and ways in which these can be supported in and through education. The UN General Assembly has declared 2022 to 2023, no, I was correct, first of all, 2022 to 2032, the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, to highlight the imperiled state of many languages. According to the UN, there are at present approximately 6,700 languages in the world, of which 96% are spoken by only 3% of the global population. Indigenous people make up less than 6% of this population, yet speak more than 4,000 of the languages. Conservative estimates suggest that more than half of the world's languages will become extinct by 2100. Dr. Burney said this is a very exciting opportunity to work on a supranational level with other experts in the field of endangered and Indigenous languages on the promotion, focusing on education. This aligns with my work with Gaelic medium education and research into Gaelic language use in school and in the community, and minority language communities in Europe in general. Good news story there, Maureen, and although Dr. Burney is mentioning Gaelic, obviously has implications for Scots and its status in Scotland also.
Yes, I mean, there are Scotland's detractors who think that we should be a monoglot country and only speak English. And, you know, I was delighted as Minister for Schools and Skills to be able to embed Gaelic and Scots languages, including Doric, into use in the curriculum for excellence, so that children who came to school only speaking Gaelic or Doric in the situation in the Northeast were not at an immediate disadvantage when the lessons were conducted in English. And we've seen a flurry of books, for example, in Doric and Scots, including nursery rhyme books and things, to highlight that these languages should be part of the school curriculum from day one. And it's great that the language researcher from Strathclyde University is on this UNESCO panel, perhaps reflecting the fact that Scotland is working constantly on protecting minority languages. Indeed, is there not a bill currently going through the Scottish Parliament to embed Scots and Gaelic in our culture and on society? So this is good news that that's been recognised by UNESCO, and I'm sure Dr. Bernay will be able to bring back to Scotland lots of information on this that she gleans from other countries. I mean, you go to Spain and you get your phone pings up with loads of different languages that you can join when you go to Spain. So we're not the outliers here. England as a one language country is the outlier.
Yeah, thank you. It just does seem such a shame that in Scotland, Gaelic and Scots seem to be a burden or are accused of being a drag on young people's attempts to get on in life, whereas in other countries, the minority languages are nurtured and are seen as a jewel of the country's culture. So let's hope that this helps change those attitudes in those who feel that way. Well, that's it for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Right now, we urgently need to increase our donations if we are to be able to pay our bills. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but our income is just over £2,000 a month, and we are now facing mounting debts. Please donate whatever you can afford. So thank you, Maureen Watt, for joining us this evening, and thank you at home for watching, and we hope you will join us again soon. Goodbye and good night.